On October 16, 1928, the most powerful central banker on earth is bleeding out in a New York hospital bed. His name is Benjamin Strong, governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and his body is failing after a lifetime of tuberculosis and surgical complications. As he breathes his last, a secret international financial architecture begins to crack. The men gathered outside his room do not know it yet, but they are about to oversee the total destruction of global wealth. The stock market crash of 1929 did not cause the Great Depression. That is the story we have all been told, but it is dangerously incomplete. To find the true origin of the Great Depression and understand what historians get wrong, we have to look past the ticker tape of Wall Street. The real origins trace back to a shattered financial order left by the First World War, a global gold hoarding crisis engineered by central banks in Paris and Washington, the death of Strong himself, extreme wealth inequality that had already hollowed out consumer demand, and a catastrophic trade war that demolished international cooperation at the worst possible moment. Benjamin Strong held the world economy together with personal handshakes and secret meetings with Montague Norman of the Bank of England, Émile Moreau of the Banque de France, and Hjalmar Schacht of the German Reichsbank. He created a system built entirely on his own absolute authority and personal relationships. When he dies, there is no one left who knows how to operate the machine. The men who replace him, particularly George Harrison, are obsessed with domestic stock speculation and utterly blind to the international debt loop dragging the world toward the abyss. That toxic debt loop starts in 1918. When the guns of the First World War fall silent, Europe is completely bankrupt. The United Kingdom and France owe immense sums of physical gold and money to the United States Treasury for weapons, ammunition, and grain. But London and Paris have no money left to pay. Instead, they demand astronomical reparations from a defeated Germany, insisting Berlin foot the bill for the entire terminal outcome of the war. Germany, stripped of its most productive industrial territories like the Ruhr Valley, simply prints paper marks to buy foreign currency. This triggers a hyperinflationary spiral so severe that citizens need literal wheelbarrows of cash to buy a single loaf of bread, and workers are paid twice a day so they can buy food before prices double again. The United States steps in with the Dawes Plan in 1924, but it only creates a massive, unstable cycle of debt. American private bankers lend millions of dollars to Germany. Germany uses those borrowed dollars to pay war reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain then send those exact same dollars right back across the Atlantic to Washington to pay off their war debts. The entire global economy becomes a giant shell game, balanced entirely on the willingness of American private investors to keep buying German bonds. It is a fragile, rotting foundation masked by the dazzling prosperity of the Roaring Twenties. In the United States, assembly lines churn out Model T Fords, radios, and electric refrigerators. The cities glow with neon lights and jazz music. But beneath the surface, structural rot is eating the economy alive. By 1929, the top 1% of Americans control nearly 40% of the nation's total wealth. Corporate profits skyrocket by 65% over the decade, but ordinary wages barely move an inch. Farmers, who make up a full quarter of the American workforce, are already living in a brutal economic depression. During the war, the federal government paid them record prices to feed Europe. They took out heavy mortgages to buy tractors and expand their acreage. When the war ended, global wheat prices crashed. Now, millions of rural Americans cannot afford the consumer goods spilling out of the factories. Wealth inequality has fundamentally hollowed out consumer demand. The factories keep producing, but the middle class has run out of purchasing power. To keep buying, everyday people turn to installment credit. They buy cars on margin, they buy radios on margin, and eventually they buy stocks on margin. Wall Street transforms into a massive casino. Men like Charles Mitchell, the head of National City Bank, actively sell shares directly to the public, promising endless returns. Showshine boys, teachers, and taxi drivers leverage their life savings 10 to 1 just to buy a piece of the American dream. When the market turns, they face margin calls they cannot pay, wiping out their families in a single afternoon. With Benjamin Strong dead, the Federal Reserve in Washington looks at this speculative mania and panics. They see the stock market bubble and decide to pop it by raising interest rates in early 1929. This is the fatal mistake. Raising rates makes borrowing expensive, which immediately chokes off the flow of American loans to Germany. The toxic international debt loop halts overnight. Germany slides into a severe recession months before Wall Street even flinches. Meanwhile, a global gold hoarding crisis is already underway in Europe. Under the strict rules of the gold standard, a nation's paper money is firmly tied to the physical gold sitting in its central bank vaults. But the Banque de France, under the leadership of Émile Moreau, refuses to play by the rules. France intentionally undervalues the franc to boost its domestic exports, and Moreau demands payment in physical gold bars, literally shipping immense amounts of bullion out of London and Berlin on private trains. The Federal Reserve does the exact same thing, hoarding gold in the vaults of New York to back its domestic currency. Together, Paris and Washington drain the lifeblood of the international monetary system. Countries losing gold are forced to raise their own interest rates to defend their currencies, intentionally throwing their own economies into recession just to stop the gold from leaving. Deflation takes hold across the globe. Prices drop, businesses fail. The stock market crash in October 1929 is not the catalyst. It is merely the first loud crack in a dam that has been weakening for an entire decade. On Black Tuesday, the ticker machines run hours behind as billions of dollars in fictional wealth simply vanish into thin air. Men crowd around the New York Stock Exchange in absolute shock. But even then, a total economic collapse is not inevitable. The true disaster arrives in the freezing winter of 1930. A mid-sized institution in New York called the Bank of United States faces a sudden run. Despite its official-sounding name, it is a purely private bank, holding the life savings of hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants in the Bronx and Brooklyn. When rumors spread about its insolvency, depositors line up around the block, desperate to withdraw their hard-earned cash. In the past, clearinghouses and the Federal Reserve would step in to provide emergency liquidity, saving the bank to prevent panic from spreading to other institutions. But the board of the Federal Reserve looks at the Bank of the United States and decides to let it fail. Historians fiercely debate the motives here. Scholars like Milton Friedman point to strict adherence to the real bills doctrine, a flawed economic theory that told the Fed to do nothing and let weak banks die. Other economic historians argue this decision was driven by outright anti-Semitism and class prejudice, as the old money establishment on Wall Street despised the immigrant bankers running the Bank of the United States. Whatever the true motive, the Fed's fatal paralysis triggers a devastating chain reaction. When the Bank of the United States collapses, taking the savings of 400,000 depositors with it, millions of Americans realize no bank is safe. People rush to pull their money out of every bank in the country. To meet the massive wave of cash withdrawals, banks are forced to call in loans early, forcing local businesses to liquidate inventory and fire workers just to pay the banks back. Without banks to provide basic credit, farmers cannot buy seed, grocers cannot stock shelves, and factories cannot buy raw materials. Over 9,000 banks fail in the early 1930s. The entire money supply of the United States shrinks by a third. It is a terrifying deflationary trap that turns a severe recession into a catastrophic depression. Instead of fixing the banking system, politicians make the worst possible decision at the worst possible moment. Enter Senator Reed Smoot and Representative Willis Hawley. They draft a massive tariff bill designed to protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition. Against the desperate warnings of more than 1,000 economists who sign a massive petition begging him to veto the legislation, President Herbert Hoover signs the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law in June 1930. It raises taxes on over 20,000 imported goods to record levels. The political goal is to force Americans to buy domestic products. The actual result is an immediate, devastating trade war. Foreign nations instantly retaliate. Canada, America's largest trading partner, slaps massive tariffs on American goods. Europe follows suit. International trade drops by over 60% in just 3 short years. Cargo ships sit rusting in harbors. Docks fall completely silent. The Smoot-Hawley tariff demolishes international cooperation just when the world desperately needs it most. Nations retreat into isolated economic blocs, hoarding resources and turning a blind eye to the suffering of their global neighbors. This financial rot quickly infects the political system. In Germany, the total collapse of American credit and the crushing burden of war reparations leave millions unemployed, starving, and angry. The Weimar Republic attempts to enforce brutal austerity, cutting wages and social benefits to maintain their commitment to the gold standard. The desperate German population, looking for someone to blame for their misery, turns to radical political factions. The economic misery directly paves the way for the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe. The failure of democratic capitalism becomes the ultimate recruitment tool for fascism. Look closely at the numbers from 1932. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is down 89% from its peak. United States Steel, the undisputed crown jewel of American industry, is operating at just 12% of its capacity. Wheat is selling for 38 cents a bushel, which is literally less than it costs a desperate farmer to harvest and transport it to market. In the cities, men who used to manage bank branches are fighting in alleyways over scraps of food behind restaurants. Shantytowns built of scrap wood, tar paper, discarded packing crates, and corrugated metal spring up in Central Park and along muddy riverbanks, bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles. The physical reality of the Great Depression is a relentless, grinding poverty. People are not just losing money in abstract investment accounts. They are losing their homes, their dignity, and their lives. The federal government, still trapped in the rigid orthodoxy of the gold standard and balanced budgets, refuses to provide direct federal relief. President Hoover insists that local charities and state governments should handle the crisis, but their coffers are completely empty. It is a systemic breakdown on every single level of human organization. The central banks refused to provide liquidity when the banking system was dying. The politicians refused to keep borders open to trade when commerce was stalling. The financial elites refused to acknowledge that their endless hoarding of wealth had starved the consumer base they relied on. The system fails because the people in charge of the system actively choose policies that guarantee its destruction. The turning point only comes when the rigid rules of the past are finally broken. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt takes office and immediately does what the previous administration claimed was completely impossible. He closes every single bank in the country for a 4-day holiday, stopping the panic withdrawals by force of federal law. He goes on the radio, speaking directly to the American people in his first fireside chat, calmly explaining the mechanics of banking and asking them to trust the system again. When the banks reopen, the lines of panicked depositors are gone. More importantly, Roosevelt takes the United States off the gold standard. He officially confiscates private gold and intentionally devalues the dollar, ending the deflationary death spiral once and for all. By severing the absolute link to physical gold, the government can finally print money to stimulate the economy. Prices slowly begin to rise. Factories slowly reopen. But the damage is so deep and so profound that a full economic recovery will not actually happen until the massive industrial mobilization of the Second World War. The Great Depression is not solved by a single clever policy. It is eventually burned away by the kinetic action of a global conflict that costs millions of lives. This is the full story that most history books leave out. It is not merely a tale of greedy stockbrokers jumping from high-rise windows after losing their fortunes. It is an autopsy of institutional failure and human arrogance. The true origin of the Great Depression shows us exactly how fragile our modern financial systems remain to this day. The decisions made in the boardroom of the Federal Reserve, the gold vaults of Paris, and the halls of Congress dictated the ultimate fate of millions of innocent people. The terrifying truth is that many of the exact same conditions exist right now. Extreme wealth concentration is once again hollowing out the middle class and destroying consumer purchasing power. Global debt is at absolute record levels, tied together in complex, opaque financial structures that few regulators truly understand. Trade tensions are rising around the globe, with nations eager to throw up tariffs and retreat into economic isolationism. Central banks are once again forced to balance the razor edge of inflation against the constant threat of widespread bank failures. If history proves anything, it is that the wrong decisions in the right rooms can break the entire world in a matter of months. We like to think we are smarter now that the economic safeguards put in place after the 1930s will permanently protect us from another systemic collapse. But institutions are only as strong as the flawed humans running them, and humans still panic, still hoard, and still defend their own short-term interests at the expense of the whole. Are we currently setting ourselves up for a repeat of the 1930s, or have we actually learned the painful lessons of the past? Let me know what you think down in the comments. And if you want to understand the hidden forces shaping our global economy, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more deep historical information.